My name is Warren, and the night I nearly died, my wife was already planning the paperwork. I didn't know any of this while I was unconscious. While doctors in blue scrubs worked to stop the internal bleeding from a ruptured appendix, while machines beeped around me and tubes ran into both my arms, I was somewhere far away from all of it. I wasn't thinking about the estate. I wasn't thinking about the board. I wasn't thinking about anything at all. But Diane was thinking, clearly, carefully, with a kind of focus that had nothing to do with whether her husband would survive the night. I learned the details later, piece by piece, from people who were there. The attending nurse, a quiet woman named Priscilla, had been at the station just outside my room when she first heard Diane's voice on the phone. It was past midnight. The hallway was nearly empty. Most family members in that wing were crying quietly or staring at walls. Diane was not crying. She was speaking in a low, controlled voice, the kind people use when they're focused on getting something done. Priscilla couldn't hear every word, but she heard enough. She heard the word attorney. She heard the phrase, if he doesn't make it through. And she heard something that would stay with her for weeks. She heard Diane say, "Let's be ready to move quickly." Priscilla stood very still. Then she went back to her desk and wrote it down. By the time the sun came up, Diane had already called 3 people. The first was her personal attorney, a man named Conrad, who had handled her finances before she ever met me. The second was my brother, Felix, who lived 2 states away and arrived looking pale and confused. The third was a woman named Bernadette, who sat on the board of my company, Archervale Holdings. To every one of them, Diane presented the same picture. She was calm. She was brave. She was the devoted wife holding everything together while her husband fought for his life. She told Felix she was doing what Warren would want. She told Bernadette decisions couldn't wait because the company needs stability. She told Conrad to review the estate documents so there would be no delays if things took a turn. Every person who saw her that morning walked away impressed. She didn't look like a woman afraid of losing her husband. She looked like someone completely in control of a difficult situation. That was the performance. It was a good one. But Bernadette had known me for 11 years. She had watched me build Archervale from a small consultancy into something worth considerably more. After Diane walked away, Bernadette stood by the window and thought about one thing. I had never once described Diane as someone who would handle estate matters without me in the room. She made a quiet note in her phone and said nothing. "I need to take you back because you have to understand who I was before that hospital room. I built Archervale over 14 years. I started it with a borrowed desk, a secondhand laptop, and one client who paid me $3,000 to reorganize their supply chain spreadsheets. I was 31, recently out of a corporate job that paid well but felt hollow, with one clear belief: that careful, consistent work would always outlast flashy ambition. I worked 7 days a week for the first 3 years. I hired slowly. I trusted carefully. I built systems that could run without me. Not because I planned to leave, but because I believed a company that needed its founder present every second was a fragile company. That philosophy extended to everything, including my personal life. When I married Diane 8 years ago, I trusted her completely. I added her to our shared accounts. I gave her financial authority over household decisions. I was generous with her in ways that people close to me noticed and admired. But I was also careful, not because I suspected her, because I had built my entire professional life on one principle: never let kindness become carelessness. So, quietly, without making it a discussion, I had built certain things into my estate plan. Not traps, not weapons, just safeguards. The kind that would never matter if everything stayed fine. They mattered now. Diane had always believed that my cautious nature was a kind of weakness. She found my insistence on oversight procedures exhausting. She found my habit of keeping independent legal counsel paranoid. Once, after I quietly updated a clause in my estate documents, she laughed and said, "Warren, you plan for everything. It's exhausting to live with." I smiled and said nothing. She interpreted my silence as agreement. She thought I was embarrassed by my own caution, that I knew somewhere deep down that she was right, that I was too controlled, too slow to simply trust. But that was never what my silence meant. My silence meant I had already made the decision. It meant the conversation was academic because the work was done. I didn't need to defend the choice because it was already embedded into documents she had never read closely enough. The specific clause I had insisted on, over the objection of my first estate attorney, who called it unusual, was simple. It stated that in any medical emergency where I was incapacitated, no estate assets could be transferred without a formal competency review by an independent medical panel and a second signature from my designated trustee. My designated trustee was not Diane. It was Felix. Felix had eaten at our table. He had been at our wedding, and he had no idea he was the lock that Diane could not pick. 3 days after I was admitted, I was still unconscious. The doctors had stabilized me through the first surgery, but a secondary infection had set in, and they had taken me back into the operating room for a second procedure. My fever was high. My condition was listed as critical but stable. On the third day, Priscilla was finishing her shift when she noticed Diane in the family waiting room speaking very quietly with Conrad. This time, Diane was showing him something on her phone, a document. A long one. Priscilla walked past slowly. She caught the words accelerated and primary beneficiary window. She kept walking. She went to the nurse's break room and sat down. She had worked in the ICU for 9 years. She had seen every kind of grieving spouse. She had a specific feeling about what she had witnessed over the past 3 days. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like scheduling. She picked up her phone and wrote a message to her supervisor, and she said she had something she needed to document formally, and told her to come in 30 minutes early the next morning. Priscilla said she would. What Diane did not know, what no one outside of Felix and my attorney, a sharp woman named Harriet, knew, was that the clause in my estate plan had a very specific trigger. The moment I was admitted to the ICU and listed as incapacitated, a private notification was automatically sent to Harriet's office. A digital alert built into my estate management system. Harriet received it at 2:17 a.m. the night I was brought in. By morning, she had confirmed one critical fact. Any attempt to transfer, liquidate, or restructure my assets while I was listed as incapacitated would be blocked at the institutional level. The banks, the board, and the holding company charter all contained the same language. Nothing moved without medical clearance from an independent panel and Felix's countersignature. Harriet did not call Diane. She simply began monitoring. That monitoring became important on day 4, when Conrad submitted a formal request to Archer Vale's board secretary, asking for a special emergency vote to temporarily transfer executive estate authority to Diane. The board secretary, a meticulous man named Otis, received the request, read it twice, and immediately forwarded it to Bernadette. Bernadette forwarded it to Harriet. Harriet responded in one sentence, "Do not act on this. It triggers the competency clause." The request was quietly shelved. Diane was told it was under review. She pushed for a faster answer. She did not know that the procedure she was pushing against had been designed specifically to stop her. By day 5, Diane had shifted tactics. The formal legal route was stalling, so she moved to the board directly. She set up a call with 3 of the 6 board members. She said the company was vulnerable. She said, "Warren, I would want stability." She said a temporary transfer of executive authority to her was simply responsible planning. 2 of the 3 were sympathetic. She was composed, articulate, and framed everything as protecting the company rather than gaining control. But the 3rd board member was Bernadette. Bernadette listened to everything Diane said. Then she asked one question. "Diane, did Warren discuss this arrangement with you directly? Did he tell you he wanted you to have executive authority if he was ever incapacitated?" There was a brief pause. Diane said, "He trusted me completely." Bernadette said, "That's not what I asked." The call ended shortly after. Bernadette told both board members to take no action until there was legal clarity. Both agreed. That night, Diane made her most reckless move yet. She called Conrad and told him to file a transfer request directly with the probate court, not the board, arguing that I was unlikely to recover full cognitive function. She filed the paperwork the next morning. The same morning Diane filed that paperwork, Priscilla walked into the hospital compliance office and sat down with and in a compliance officer named Stewart. She told them everything she had heard and seen over the past 5 days. She described the midnight phone call. She described the waiting room meeting with Conrad. She described the document on the phone. She was calm and specific, and she had written down the dates and times of each incident in a small notebook she kept in her scrubs pocket. Stewart asked careful questions. He asked if she had directly heard instructions given to legal counsel. She said she had heard Diane tell someone to be ready to move quickly on the night of admission, and that she had heard the word accelerated used in what appeared to be an estate document conversation. He asked if she would provide a formal written statement. She said yes without hesitating. It took her 40 minutes to write it. She described each incident in order, with dates, times, and exact words she remembered. She signed it. Stewart signed as a witness. A copy was placed in the compliance file, and another was sent to the hospital's legal liaison, a thorough woman named Claudette. Claudette read it the same afternoon, recognized that it overlapped with a probate filing on her desk, and picked up the phone to call Harriet. I opened my eyes on day 7. The first thing I saw was a white ceiling with a long fluorescent light. The second was a monitor with a green line running across it. The third was Felix, sitting in a chair by the window with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. I tried to speak. What came out was barely a sound, but it was enough. Felix's eyes opened immediately. He was at my side in 3 steps. The doctors came in quickly. They asked me questions, my name, the year where I was. I answered all of them slowly but correctly. A tall man named Dr. Abe told me the surgery had gone well, but recovery would take time. He said I'd been unconscious for 7 days. 7 days. I asked Felix what I had missed. He looked at me for a moment. Then he pulled his chair close and said, "Warren, I need to tell you some things. But first I need to know how you're feeling, because some of this is going to take a minute." I told him I was tired but clear. He nodded. Then he began to talk. By the time he finished, 20 minutes later, I had not moved once. I just listened. With every sentence, something cold and calm settled in my chest. I asked for my phone. Then I asked for Harriet. Harriet arrived the next morning. She sat at the foot of my bed with a folder in her lap and walked me through everything with the quiet efficiency that had made me trust her for 12 years. The notification trigger, the board request, Conrad's court filing, Priscilla's statement. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "How solid are the safeguards?" She said, "Completely solid. Without Felix's countersignature and a medical panel clearance, nothing moved and nothing will move. The court filing is based on a false claim of cognitive impairment with no medical documentation. It will be dismissed." Then she slid Priscilla's written statement across the blanket. I read every line twice. I read, "Be ready to move quickly." I read, "Accelerated." I folded it carefully. "What's the plan?" I asked. Harriet said there was an emergency board and family meeting in 3 days. Diane had requested it, believing she still had momentum to formalize her authority. She did not yet know about the statement. She did not know the competency clause had blocked every avenue she had tried. She thought she was walking into a room she was about to control. She was walking into something else entirely. Diane's next move came 2 days before the meeting. She contacted the hospital's patient liaison and submitted a formal request for a cognitive assessment of me, citing concerns about post-surgical mental clarity. She used language like ensuring Warren can make fully informed decisions and protecting him from stress before he is fully recovered. What she was actually doing was trying to build a medical record to support her court filing. Any notation suggesting reduced cognitive function could serve as evidence that her temporary control was justified. Stewart flagged the request immediately. He brought it to Claudette. Claudette called Dr. Abe directly. Dr. Abe came to my room that same afternoon and told me exactly what had been requested. I said, "Do the assessment." He blinked. "You're not concerned?" I said, "I want on the record, officially, with full documentation. Today." The assessment took 45 minutes. I recalled dates, names, sequences of events, the current composition of my board, and the last 3 significant contracts Archervale had closed. I was precise and patient. Dr. Abe signed the paperwork. It showed no cognitive impairment of any kind. That document was added to my official medical file. Diane's protective request had just handed me the cleanest possible rebuttal to her own court filing. The meeting was held in a private conference room on the 4th floor of the Archervale building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a hospital aide. Felix walked beside me. Harriet sat near the door. Bernadette was already there at the far end of the long table. The other 5 board members sat along the sides. Family members, Diane's sister Paula, her mother Irene, and 2 cousins, sat in chairs along the wall. I had been discharged that morning. Dr. Abe had told me to rest and avoid stress. I told him I would be at a meeting in 6 hours. He had sighed and written the discharge summary. When I entered the room, the effect was immediate. Paula's mouth fell open. Irene stood, then sat back down, unsure what to do. Board members who had been considering Diane's request looked at each other quickly, and Diane, standing near the window with Conrad, turned around. She saw me. For just 1 second, behind the composed expression, something flickered. Not guilt, not shame, just recalculation, like a chess player whose opponent has appeared on the board unexpectedly. She recovered quickly. She smiled. She said, "Warren, you're here." I said, "I am." I was wheeled to the head of the table. Diane spoke first. She stood at the front of the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had rehearsed the speech and believed in it. She talked about difficult days and hard decisions. She said the company needed stability. She said she had taken certain preparatory steps because any responsible spouse would. She said she loved me and that everything she had done was for us. It was well delivered. Some of the family members were nodding. One junior board member looked visibly moved. I waited until she finished. Then Conrad spoke briefly in support of her, citing standard estate management procedures and describing the court filing as a precautionary measure. There was a pause. Diane looked at me. I think she expected me to respond emotionally, to push back. That was how our disagreements had always gone. I stayed quiet. She pressed. I eventually relented. But I didn't speak. I looked at the door, and Claudette, who had been waiting just outside, walked in. She introduced herself, stated her role, and said she had a formal statement from the hospital's compliance department directly relevant to the matters being discussed. The room changed. Claudette read Priscilla's statement aloud. She read every word of it. The midnight phone call. Let's be ready to move quickly. The waiting room meeting with Conrad on day 3. The document on the phone. The word accelerated, heard in the context of what appeared to be estate paperwork. She read each entry clearly, with its date and time. She did not editorialize. She did not add commentary. She simply read what a 9-year ICU nurse had carefully written down and signed. The room was completely silent by the second paragraph. I watched Diane's face the entire time. The composure held. It was remarkable, the discipline of it. But her hands, clasped on the table, tightened. Her knuckles shifted. That was the only thing that gave her away. When Claudette finished, she thanked the room and sat down. For several seconds, no one said anything. Then Paula, Diane's own sister, said very quietly, "Diane, what is she talking about?" Conrad started to speak. Harriet cut across him smoothly, saying the statement had been formally logged with compliance and was now part of the documented record, already forwarded to the court in response to the probate filing. Irene put her hand to her mouth. Diane said, "This is being taken completely out of context." But the silence that followed her words was of a different quality than the silence before them. I spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I always had in board meetings, steadily, with clean sentences. I was still in the wheelchair. I did not stand. I did not need to. I said I want to clarify the facts about my estate structure because there appeared to be confusion about what was legally possible. I opened the folder in my lap and slid copies around the table. Each copy contained the competency clause, the one requiring a medical panel clearance and Felix's countersignature, the one that had been in the documents for 6 years. I said, no estate asset can be transferred, restructured, or placed under alternative authority without these 2 conditions. Neither condition has been met. Therefore, nothing filed, requested, or prepared in the past 10 days has any legal effect. I looked at Conrad as I said the last part. I said the probate court filing had been submitted without medical documentation, based on a false claim of cognitive impairment. I said the formal assessment conducted by Dr. Abe, included in the folder, showed no impairment of any kind. I said the board request had no legal basis under the Archervale Charter and had been correctly shelved by Otis. Bernadette said quietly but clearly, I'd like to formally move that we acknowledge Warren's full and uninterrupted authority over his estate and his company, effective immediately. 4 hands went up before she finished the sentence. Conrad spoke again. He was trying to salvage something. He said Diane's actions had been taken in good faith. He said, be ready to move quickly was a natural instruction from a spouse managing a crisis. He said the court filing was protective, not aggressive. Harriet let him finish. Then she placed a second document on the table. It was a timeline. 14 items in chronological order, each with a date, a description, and the corresponding documentation source. The midnight phone call. Day 2's call to Bernadette about company stability. Day 3's document review in the waiting room. Day 4's board request. Day 5's call to the 3 board members. Day 7's court filing. Day 8's request for a cognitive assessment. Every item was sourced. Every item was documented. It removed the possibility of coincidence. Harriet said, this is not a series of independent protective measures taken under stress. This is a sequential, coordinated strategy. The first contact with legal counsel occurred less than 4 hours after Warren was admitted to the ICU, before any medical prognosis had been given. Then she said, the court filing claims Warren is unlikely to regain full cognitive function. At the time it was filed, he had been unconscious for 7 days due to post-surgical sedation, not brain injury. The filing misrepresents his medical condition to a court of law. Conrad had stopped talking. Harriet said, that misrepresentation has legal consequences. Diane finally turned away from the window. She said the timeline was misleading. She said her decisions were made in genuine fear and that no one in the room could understand what it felt like to watch their spouse in the ICU not knowing if they would survive. For a moment, a few people in the room softened. But then Bernadette said, Diane, the filing was submitted on day 7. By day 7, Warren had been stable for 4 days. The doctors had told you directly that his prognosis was positive. Diane said, doctors can be wrong. Bernadette said, they can. But the filing specifically references his cognitive state as a reason to transfer authority. His cognitive state was never medically in question. That claim wasn't based on fear. It was fabricated. Paula stood up from the wall. She said, Diane, stop. Diane looked at her sister. Paula said, just stop. It was the quietest moment in the room and somehow the loudest. Conrad whispered something to Diane. She shook her head once. He whispered again. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she asked for the meeting to be paused, pending her own legal review. Harriet said that was her right. She also said the competency clause documents had already been submitted to the court and the hearing scheduled for the following week would proceed regardless. Diane said nothing. The audit was proposed by Bernadette and approved unanimously by the board that same afternoon. It was an independent review of all estate-related activity during the period of my incapacitation. Specifically, whether any assets have been accessed or moved in ways that exceeded Diane's existing authority as a co-signatory on household accounts. The auditing firm, Renmore Associates, was given full access within 48 hours. Their review took 4 days. 3 things stood out. First, a shared household investment account within her authority had been liquidated. The funds had not been moved to another shared account. They had gone into a personal account in Diane's name only, opened 6 weeks before my surgery. Second, a commercial property I owned independently had been listed with a real estate agent on day 4 of my admission. The agent said he had been told by Diane that the owner authorized the listing. I had not. I had never discussed selling that property. Third, 2 personal insurance policies had been submitted for early beneficiary review, an active attempt to establish claim priority ahead of any formal estate process. The audit report was submitted to the court, to Harriet, and to the board. It was submitted to the Police Financial Crimes Unit the following Monday. The investigation opened the following Wednesday. The board met again the Thursday after the audit results came in. The meeting was short. The two members who had been on the call with Diane each provided written statements confirming they had taken no action. The vote itself took 4 minutes. The board voted unanimously to formally confirm my uninterrupted authority as sole executive owner of Archervale Holdings. The request for any alternative executive authority arrangement was permanently closed. Conrad's temporary board advisory access, which I had not approved and had not known about until the audit, was revoked. Otis documented everything. After the vote, Bernadette sent me a one-line message. This was always going to be the outcome. You built it that way. I read it twice. I put my phone face down on the table. In the days that followed, the story moved through the family network quietly but completely. No dramatic announcement. No public statement. But by the end of that week, every person who had watched Diane's composed performance at the hospital had been quietly told what the audit had found. Each of them, in their own time, went silent. Paula stopped returning Diane's calls. Irene told a family friend she was devastated and confused. The cousins simply disappeared from the conversation. The room Diane had carefully filled with allies had emptied, one person at a time. Felix came to see me at home 3 days after the board vote. I was sitting on the back porch with a coffee, wrapped in a blanket. My recovery was slow but steady. We sat together for a while without talking. That was something Felix and I had always been good at. Silence between us was never uncomfortable. Eventually, he said, I keep thinking about the moment you set up that trustee arrangement. You made me the second signature on your estate 6 years ago and never mentioned it again. Then Harriet called me at 2 in the morning and told me what it was blocking. I said, I didn't want you to think about it. I just wanted it to be there. He said, why didn't you tell Diane? I said, because if she was trustworthy, it would never matter. And if she wasn't, telling her would only give her time to work around it. Felix looked at his coffee cup. Did you always suspect her? I thought about it honestly. No, I didn't build those safeguards because I suspected Diane. I built them because I believe accountability should be a structure, not a reaction. I would have built them regardless of who I married. He nodded, and yet they stopped her exactly. Yes, I said. They did. Then Felix said, she believed you were too kind to have prepared for her. I said, a lot of people mistake kindness for unawareness. He looked at me. I looked at the garden. Harriet arranged the final meeting in her office, not our home. I had asked for that specifically. Diane came in alone. Conrad had withdrawn from the case following the audit. Her new solicitor, Wesley, sat beside her and said very little. I sat across from her with Harriet beside me. I had rehearsed versions of this conversation. Angry versions. Cold versions that listed every decision she had made. But when I sat down and looked at her, all of that left me. She looked genuinely tired. Not the performed tiredness of someone seeking sympathy. The kind that comes from 10 days of pretense finally breaking apart. I said, I'm not going to ask you why. I think I already know. She said nothing. I said, those safeguards were not built because I distrusted you. They were built because accountability is a principle. You were never going to be able to move those assets. No one would have been. She said, very quietly, I thought you were going to die. I said, and so you acted before the doctors could tell you otherwise. She looked at the table. I was scared. I said, scared people make calls. They don't open new bank accounts 6 weeks before their husband's unscheduled emergency surgery. She had no answer. Harriet handed Wesley the separation terms. I stood up and said, I prepared for uncertainty, Diane. I'm sorry you didn't know me well enough to know that. I left. The investigation moved at its own pace, and I did not try to speed it up or slow it down. The Financial Crimes Unit reviewed the audit report, the insurance filings, the property listing, the liquidated investment account, and the timeline Harriet had constructed, cross-referenced with phone records and compliance documentation. In the 4th week after my discharge, Diane was formally notified that she was the subject of a civil investigation for unauthorized financial activity during my medical incapacitation. The issues under examination included fraudulent misrepresentation to a court, unauthorized asset transfer, and attempted estate fraud. Wesley advised her to make no public statements. She did not. She went entirely quiet. Conrad faced a separate professional conduct review. That process was slower, but it had begun. The property listing was withdrawn. The investment funds were frozen by court order pending the investigation. The insurance filings were flagged. In a world where Diane had thought she was building control, she was now watching everything she had built being taken apart, piece by piece, by the exact structures she had assumed were too soft to stop her. She had spent 10 days trying to dismantle my accountability systems. It took those same systems about 10 days to dismantle hers. 1 month after I left the hospital, I made a decision. I did not frame it as revenge. Revenge is spending your future punishing someone for the past. It costs too much and builds nothing. What I did was restructure. I called Harriet and Bernadette to my office on a Tuesday morning and told them I wanted 3 changes to Archervale's governance, effective immediately. The first was an independent ethics committee for the board, 3 outside members with no financial stake in the company, whose sole function was to review unusual governance requests. The second was a formal charitable foundation, funded from the company's community investment budget, focused on financial literacy for families navigating estate and inheritance matters. I'd seen how many people had no idea how these systems worked, how easy it was for someone to step into a gap and exploit it. I wanted to close some of those gaps for other families. The third was personal. I updated my entire estate plan. More thorough this time. More explicit. Every clause in plain language. When Harriet reviewed the new document, she said it was the most precisely constructed personal estate plan she had ever seen. I said, "That means there are no gaps." She said, "There are no gaps." I filed it the following morning. Recovery took longer than I expected. Not the physical part, that went well. By week 6, I was walking without help. By week 8, I was back in the office part-time. But the harder recovery was quieter. It happened in the evenings, when I lay awake going back through the years of my marriage and asking myself what I had missed. The honest answer was, not as much as I feared. There had always been a quality in Diane I had chosen not to examine too closely. A calculation behind the warmth. A habit of assessing situations in terms of outcomes. I had told myself it was her practical nature. I had admired it up to a point. The point was the night I nearly died. What I had built, the safeguards, the trustee arrangement, the clauses, had protected my estate. But protection was not the same as healing. So in those months, I did slower work. I walked in the evenings. I called Felix more. I began to trust the silence of a house without performance in it. By month 4, the house felt like mine again. That was perhaps the truest thing the experience had given me back. Not just the estate, not just the company, myself. I think about that ICU night sometimes. Not with anger. The way you think about a storm that stripped the leaves from a tree and showed you exactly what the branches looked like underneath. I think about Priscilla writing in her notebook at the end of a night shift. A nurse with no stake in what happened, no reason to act except that she believed what she witnessed was wrong. She wrote it down because it was right. And because she did, everything changed. I think about Bernadette asking the one question no one else thought to ask. I think about Felix, who signed trustee documents 6 years ago and answered the phone at 2 in the morning. I think about Harriet, already working before the sun came up. The story people focus on is the betrayal. Betrayal is vivid, sharp edges, catches the light. But the real story is about the systems that held. The quiet ones, built not out of suspicion, but out of a belief that accountability, designed carefully and maintained patiently, is stronger than any single act of deception. Diane believed my kindness was naivety. She believed my patience was passivity. She believed she had read me completely. But she had only ever seen the surface of me. She had never looked at what was underneath. That structure was always there. Quiet, invisible, unmoving. And when she needed it to fail, it simply did not. I am not the same person I was before that hospital room. I am more deliberate, more honest, more clear about what my life is for. I did not survive that night just to recover what was nearly taken from me. I survived it to build something better. And that, finally is exactly what I am doing.